Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to the Quality Hub, chatting with ISO experts. I'm your host, Xavier Francis, and today I'm here with Suzanne Strausser, VP of Consulting and Development, and Brian Reich, Director of Software, both from here at Core. Glad you could both join us.
Hey, great. Thanks for having us here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
No problem. So glad to have you both with us. Now, in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about updates to ISO 27001, which is the new 2022 version.
Yeah, new. What year is it now? Yes.
Well,
it's all relatively speaking.
Yeah, so people who have had that ancient one, 2013 version of it, it's going to be new to them, and they may have not been certified to the new version yet. So we're going to talk about all that today. But before we get started, we're going to learn a little bit more about Suze and Brian, even though they both have been here. But maybe tell us a little bit about your experience from like 27001 and that.
Yeah, so I'm the director of software here at Core, recovering programmer and IT guy. So I've got lots of life experience in this stuff. We just went through the audit to do the upgrade to the 2022 version of ISO 27001. We learned a lot from that experience. I learned a lot from that experience, and I'm happy to talk about it today.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you here, because you were right there in the midst of it all and needing to know what needed to be done.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Suze?
Yeah, and I'm a recovering quality manager myself, so 27001 was new to me. But since we're certified, I became the management representative for that as well. So learning about 27 has been interesting, and glad to share what we've learned as well.
Awesome. Well, I certainly do appreciate you both being here to talk about it. All right, so we're going to start here today with Suzanne. And the first, I think, probably questions most people are going to have, what are the key updates to the latest version of 27001, and why were they introduced?
Sure. So at a real high level, there's a few key changes. So first is around structural alignment.
Okay.
So the standards clauses, which the auditable clauses are 4 through 10, they were modified slightly to better align with other ISO management standards. And it follows the Annex SL framework, if you really want to get ISO geeky. Yep. And fun fact, ISO 27 was really the first to follow Annex SL.
So they changed Annex SL.
Yeah.
And now we have to migrate a little bit more.
It's not really a wholesale realignment, but...
Gotcha.
And I'm not going to get into some of that wording in the body of the standard.
Okay.
That's out there in the public sphere and people can read. So just get a copy of the standard and compare those. There's a few things to pay attention to, but nothing that's really, insurmountable.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but ISO is really trying to get it to where a lot of these align, so it makes integrating them a lot easier.
Totally, yes.
So that's one of the reasons probably that alignment happens.
Yes. But the big deal issue then is the change in the Annex A controls section.
Okay.
So the number of controls was reduced from 114 to 93.
That's
and
cool.
It was reorganized into 4 sections instead of 14.
Wow.
So, try to streamline and get rid of redundancy.
That makes sense.
And then 11 new controls were added.
Ooh.
So focusing on things like threat intelligence and information security for cloud services and ICT readiness and so on.
Okay. So what is ICT?
Information and communication technology.
Okay. For those listeners who don't know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we'll talk about that a little bit. So basically some restructuring, new controls for the most part. Brian, do you have any insight on those new controls, since you were kind of really pressed for making sure that we are able to be audited to them?
Yeah. So my biggest insight is that our consultants hit the easy button for me by giving me a mapping of controls between the 2013 version of the standard and the new 2022 version of the standard.
Well, isn't that nice of them?
Oh, it was wonderful.
I bet.
Basically, I had to go back and do like a search replace in all of my documentation to update what procedures associated with which control in ISO 27001. Much easier with them helping me with that.
I guess I could see that, where since they changed from 114 to 93, 4 sections instead of 14, if you already have documentation going through and changing some of that.
Yeah, it all got thrown into a blender and, spit out again. So
yeah. In terms of new controls, a lot's changed in the last 10, 11 years, and they're going to continue to do so, right? Most of the new controls seemed aimed at ongoing analysis, not just of internal events, but also external risks as well.
All right. So how does the newest version of ISO 27001 address modern cybersecurity threats, which you talked to, Brian, compared to the previous editions? And maybe can you share a little bit how that affected our audit?
Sure. So being a software developer and former IT guy, I've always kind of felt like 27001 was a little bit weak sauce when you compare it to, for example, NIST 800-171 or other cybersecurity standards.
Right.
Suzanne might want to leap over the table here and gently remind me.
Nope.
No leaping. Okay, that's good. They serve different purposes, right? But to 27001 2022's credit, I kind of feel like it put a little bit of meat on the bones that I thought was missing in the past when we implemented the previous version. It feels a little more mature.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So, like I said before, the new controls mostly focus on proactive practices, not just monitoring and acting on internal security threats, but staying on top of the whole cybersecurity landscape and adapting to it. So that would be the threat intelligence control 5.7, I think. It also adds in controls to ensure that you're properly masking data. That's 8.11, and reducing the risk of leaking sensitive information by doing that.
Okay.
Then there's also the control for securely deleting data when you're done with it. And of course, for me, the 8.28 control, secure coding practices, that's near and dear to my heart. And I was absolutely relieved when I didn't have to change much in my software development lifecycle process to conform with that.
Well, that sounds like a lot of stuff, but really geared at what's going to help you. And I know I can understand probably why you thought this was weak if it came out in 2013. I mean, that means they were developing it
Everything was
2010, 2011,
'Yep.
2012. And man, that was even before or just after Sony big thing with the PlayStations that we talked about last year. So a lot has changed. So what steps can organizations take to transition from that earlier version to ISO 27001 2022?
Sure. So the very first thing what we always tell our customers to do is to make sure you're super clear about your registrar's deadline to complete the transition.
Okay.
So everybody has to be done by October 31st, 2025.
Well, that's not even the whole end of the year. So we have like 10 months.
But most registrars are requiring it well before then. So you don't want your auditor to show up and assume they are auditing to the new version and you aren't prepared.
Yeah, I can see
so
that'd be a big
communicate with your registrar.
Brian?
Yeah, from my side, for the new controls, read and understand them and think about how your current practices might actually answer those questions, right?
Okay.
If you've actually been keeping up on top of cybersecurity and how it's changed from the previous version, there's a pretty good chance you've added practices that already satisfy some of those new controls.
Okay.
After that, then start addressing your gaps. For us, we were really fortunate that we already had quite a few documented practices that satisfied the new control, like web filtering and secure coding practices, right? There were definitely a few controls that we had work to do on. We had procedures to write or tools to put in place to satisfy those.
Okay. And I really think that if you're struggling with that or not quite sure, we can help you here at Core.
Oh, absolutely.
Have one of our consultants come in and help you with those changes.
Yeah.
Not a problem at all. So what do we find are the most common challenges are that businesses are going to face when they're implementing this new standard? We talked about what they kind of have to be aware of, but what are the real challenges, do you think?
So I think for our customer and for us, it was knowing where to start. I mean, it was almost like starting over. I mean, we hadn't done I'll say a stellar job, because that's how we are. And, we're the carpenter that has the rundown house sometimes.
Yeah.
It's just
or
how
the cobbler whose kids' shoes have holes in them.
I'll be honest. So we hadn't done a real great job in reassessing our current state of controls in some time. Things hadn't changed that significantly, to be fair, but still, we wanted to go through the exercise of reviewing our controls from square one. So, we used what we did currently as our input, but then we had to reassess whether it was the right thing for us or not.
I can certainly see the alignment that changed really making sense, but that can be a big issue when you're trying to, where do we start with this? Do we do it all fresh? Like Brian said, you probably, if you stayed up on it, you probably have a lot of things that cover it, but just doing that matrix of making sure this connects with this
exactly.
Connects with that.
Sometimes it's just easier to start over.
Yeah. Brian?
Yeah. So, I'm not out in the field meeting with our customers, so I don't know what other people found challenging with 27001 2022. But I can say what was challenging for us. So there's controls such as the threat intelligence controls in the new version and various controls related to logging and monitoring. And those kind of things have an easy button solution available if you can afford them, right? A good example is with logging and monitoring, implementing a SIEM or a SIM however you say that. It stands for Security Information and Event Management. Putting one of those systems in place and then sending your security events to a SOC for analysis.
Yep.
That's a security operations center. That's the easy button solution. You're basically paying somebody else to make it their problem and for you to be compliant as a result, right? Now, if you don't want to do that, you can do these things the hard way, but these kind of controls aren't implement it and move on kind of controls. Things like identity and access management, you set up a directory, you put people in groups, like you get that stuff in place and then you just maintain it.
Right.
Threat analysis and event logging and monitoring, that takes ongoing practices, right? So,
well, and also, like the term says, monitoring.
Yeah.
You know, you're dealing with a potential threat, and this is something that's big with CMMC. I'm seeing a lot more comparison with that coming down the road. And 27001, where you need to pay attention to what's going on in your network, what potential threats are happening, what the level is, who's doing what within there. And that was not an issue necessarily in 27001.
And not even within your network, but in the world at large. Like threat intelligence is all about knowing what's going on in the cybersecurity landscape. Are there like more attacks coming from a certain geographic place in the world? Stuff like that, and staying on top of it.
Or even patches.
Patch management.
Everything.
Yeah, so that's all work that somebody has to do, and you can either pay to make it not your problem, or you can stay on top of it. And either way, you know, it's going to be a resource challenge.
Yeah. All right. So talked about it a little bit here, Suze, but how do the changes in Annex A controls impact an organization's approach to risk management? Because that's really what we're talking about here. 27001 is going to help with that specific risk when it comes to cybersecurity.
So I think because they're streamlined and they're categorized better, the new Annex A controls better emphasize a risk-based approach, and it makes it easier for organizations to prioritize and then customize controls based on their, let's say, unique risk profile.
Okay.
So, for example, smaller organizations or those with less complex IT environments can focus on implementing only those controls directly tied to their identified risks.
Okay.
And the fact that the controls are things that smaller businesses should be focused on really helps prioritize as well.
So it helps that smaller business not necessarily feel like, oh, wow, this is a huge bite we have to take.
Focus on the things that make sense.
Focus on the things that make sense. Are there any significant changes aimed at improving the standards application for smaller organizations, since we're talking about those?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, focus on relevance. So things like cloud security, business continuity, you know, in those areas, this standard is more relevant to smaller organizations that really rely heavily on outsourced or digital solutions.
I know when we started 27001, I kind of helped a little bit with that.
Yeah.
And we needed to make a decision whether we wanted to go with a hard physical server in our place of employment, or if we wanted to do cloud-based, and we chose to go cloud-based because it made more sense. We put some of the onus on that.
Yeah, so these controls kind of reflect the changing times and are much more relevant. Also through improved usability. So clearer organization of the standard itself and simplified language makes it easier for smaller teams to understand and apply.
So a little less of that ISO, we'll let you define it.
Oh, it's still in there.
It's still ISO, but before it doesn't tell you how to do anything. Here it might tell you a little bit more.
A little bit. Yep.
Okay.
And then obviously some cost efficiency. So, you know, smaller organizations often face resource and budget constraints, obviously. So these streamlined controls and hopefully reduce complexity maybe can lower some costs related to implementation and certification.
Now, a question I do have for you, Susan, this. Before, you know, you're talking about risk, and a lot of ISO says, we're not telling you what to do. You just need to assess it and determine it. Compared to some of the other standards that we've talked about, CMMC, NIST, and so on and so forth, is the new version requiring you to do things, or do you still pick the risk you want to cover when it comes to cybersecurity and maybe not
Yes and
deal with
no.
them?
I mean, you can say that some controls don't apply, but it'd be a hard argument if you're actually doing those things to exclude them. I mean, there's what we exclude, like one control. So
it is a little bit more pick and choose. It's this is kind of what you gotta do.
It is, but it would be a hard sell to exclude a ton of things.
Okay. So Brian, how can organizations future-proof their compliance strategies in light of evolving cybersecurity standards?
Can I give you my snarky answer first?
Sure.
My snarky answer would be that there ain't no future-proofing cybersecurity. But I know you're asking about how to future-proof your cybersecurity compliance.
Ah, okay. Right? There we go. Yes.
And I think in some ways the 27001 2022 update might assist with that a little bit, because it is asking you to stay on top of stuff far more than it was, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. Like, you have to stay on top of this stuff. And this is a really good example. Best practices around password complexity and password expiration have really changed in the last couple of years. And it's not reflected in 27001, not even in the 2022 update, right? Okay. So after years of recommending that organizations enforce password complexity using X number of characters of this type and that type, capitals, lowercase numbers, symbols, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
What the security experts have seen as a result is that you've got good intentions with those kind of rules, but then bad outcomes, because what it leads to is people using the same password over and over again, but putting a number on the end, which makes it more guessable. Likewise, it leads to people writing down their passwords because they can't remember them. So the guidance has changed in NIST 800-171, for example, to expire passwords less frequently and reduce and relax the types of characters that are required to be in a password, but replace that with requiring longer passwords, or better yet, passphrases that a person can remember and use without having to write it down. Right?
I got to tell you, passphrases have changed my life.
Yeah,
they really have.
Yeah.
No, they are, because I mean, you're like, we also have a password manager, but my gosh, I can think of a phrase that only I know, or you know, and it's just, it really helps.
I get too clever. I feel like I get too clever, and then I can't remember my own phrase. It seems like it makes sense at the time. So I'm thankful for the password manager. But
well, I am too. Don't get me wrong.
I'm also older, so you know,
not by much.
Whatever.
I mean, you and Brian are pretty close to the same age, right? Yeah.
No.
It's all relative. I guess that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like, you can't leave it to 27001 to tell you what the next best thing to do in cybersecurity is going to be. You need to stay on top of that.
That's right.
And that's how you're going to future-proof.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, do either one of you have anything else you'd want to add about 27001 and the new version that might have to do with maybe documentation, how you're supposed to handle that, or specific things that you should do, maybe some best practices, or just thoughts in general?
Well, I would say at this point, if you haven't started the transition, you better get on it.
Yeah.
Because you're behind the 8 ball right now.
Okay. Yeah.
So, start your learning and honestly call us and we can help. That'll be the easiest path.
So get started now.
Yeah.
Do you also find that maybe this standard is more in line of, a lot of people have a quality manager. They might have an MREP even though it's not required. Because you got to stay on top of it so much, you really need somebody that's been assigned this.
Yes.
Versus before, it's like, okay, we got these practices in place. We'll just go to the next audit.
Yeah.
Okay. Brian, got anything?
I mean, I guess my answer that's totally going to sound self-serving, but it's true. I sort of acted as the customer in this experience, and working with our consultants on the 27001 audit was a great experience.
Yeah.
One of the things that was absolutely invaluable to me was that when I started investigating the new controls, Suzanne surfaced out to me this wonderful document we have that our consultants put together that takes the 27001 controls and makes them accessible. There's pages of explanation and examples for every control. One of the things that I've always found insanely frustrating about ISO standards from a programmer's perspective is, like, I just want you to tell me the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's not what ISO does.
No.
But that document, it gave examples. It made the language of the controls very accessible. And I don't know how I would have got through the audit without that as a resource.
And sometimes just the expertise is needed. And that's one of the reasons we're here, to help you guys. Well, this has been a great talk today. Hopefully people that are part of 27001 already have it and they need to get to the new version, updated the new version. They'll understand what's a little bit more needed, what to expect. Really great talk today. Good examples, Brian, having gone through this. Really appreciate you both being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we want to thank everyone who's listened to our podcast today. We hope it's been informative for you. Now, if you're looking for more information about Core Business Solutions and how we can help you with ISO certification, cybersecurity, or even customized training, please email us at info@thecoresolution.com. You can also visit our website at www.thecoresolution.com. And if you haven't already followed us on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube, please be sure to do so, and that way you won't miss the next Quality Hub podcast when it's dropped next week. Have a great day.